From Bob and Fred's perspective, this case starts with the two of them going to their house in Galena, where they'll do long weekends and little trips with their family. And they went there 1 week in advance of Fred's 89th birthday party.
Instead of celebrating Fred Sr.'s birthday, his children had to plan his funeral.
On that Sunday, coming back home from Galena, they were headed east on Route 20 out near Stockton, Illinois. They found themselves behind a semi-trailer, at which point they came upon this curve to the left. Bob was driving the vehicle. He was traveling below the speed limit. He kept a safe distance behind the truck, according to all accounts. But there was a curve to the left in the roadway where, as the semi-trailer was taking the left curve, from Bob's perspective, driving his pickup truck behind the semi-trailer, he would lose sight of it because there was a big hill on the left and the curve was of such a change in direction that you couldn't see the semi-trailer for some short period of time.
The semi-tractor trailer encroached on the center line, the center dividing line. And again, this is a two-way road, so there's traffic going east, traffic going west. And there, at the same time this started to happen, a Mercedes SUV operated by the defendant, Mary Norman, was coming in the opposite direction towards the semi-tractor trailer. And she also got too close to the center line. They ended up making contact on the rear axle of the tractor trailer, and her vehicle then was caused to rotate counterclockwise, spin out of control, and hit the Krischon vehicle head on.
Panera, the company that was responsible for the truck providing this over-the-road delivery, had failed to properly train its driver on bearing to the right or bowing out to the right in order to avoid off-tracking. Instead, the back end of his truck crossed the center line, creating contact with the SUV, which then went into the opposite lane of travel and caused a head-on collision with the Krischons.
There was no allegation that the Krischon family did anything wrong. Bob, driving the car, was just driving behind the semi-truck. There was never any sort of allegations that he was negligent. He was, for a lack of a better way of saying it, sort of just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So when that Mercedes SUV struck his vehicle head-on, that led to Fred Sr. passing away at the scene. So he passed away in the vehicle. People had to pull him out of the vehicle because the car caught on fire. Bob, who was operating the vehicle, was badly injured and could not get out of the vehicle on his own. So he had to have people pull him out as well. But if you can imagine the harrowing nature of this, the vehicle is starting, there's first smoke and then it starts on fire and people are running and trying to get them out. So yeah, it was, a horrendous crash. Bob, as I've mentioned, he had no warning this crash was going to occur because of the roadway and how he didn't see the initial impact between the semi-tractor trailer and the Mercedes. The first time he realized anything was going to happen was when a Mercedes logo was literally coming at the front of his vehicle and there was nothing he could do. His airbags went off in his vehicle, and he says the first thing after that boom explosion, he recalled looking over at his father and just the way his dad looked. He said, I knew he was deceased. And he can't get out because he's in such bad shape. So thankfully there were people around who were able, they actually had to break his window and get him out. And then once he got out, he was terrified that they wouldn't be able to get his father's body out of the vehicle. Thankfully, some bystanders were able to pull Fred Sr. out of the vehicle and, they came and tried to perform CPR on him, but unfortunately, he had passed away.
This crash changed Bob's life forever. There's before Bob and there's after Bob. Before Bob was a much more engaging, fun-loving, excited type of a person. Someone who wanted to do everything he could for his family. The after Bob is a fellow who has dealt with a devastating right foot injury. He's had 4 surgeries. He's going to have more. He's likely headed for an ankle replacement surgery because he continues to develop joint arthritis in the various joints within his foot and now in his ankle. And so it's really just been an arduous process ever since this crash for Bob. He's dealt with infections. He's dealt with immobility issues. It really has had just a devastating impact on his life. On top of it, he lost one of his best friends, his dad.
One moment that will stick with me was when Fred Krischon Jr. testified that he still goes fishing, but his dad's no longer with him. And there are moments when he's out on the water and he forgets that his dad's not there. So he'll start to say, "Hey, Dad," only to remember that his dad is no longer with him.
Friends, family, everyone basically said this was such a fun-loving, hardworking, go-getting, get-after-things kind of guy. And after this crash occurred, he still wanted to be that same guy. But I think his wife maybe said it the best. She was just like, this guy unfortunately doesn't exist anymore.
The main target at trial was Panera, and most generally you can think of the case involving inadequate training policies, inadequate retraining, and inadequate retention of the driver, because the driver in question was not trained properly on this kind of vehicle, and at trial demonstrated a complete lack of basic fundamentals in terms of the way to properly operate this truck.
At no point in time was Panera able to produce any evidence that the defendant driver, Mr. Valencia, had actually passed a road test in a semi-trailer. In fact, he did a test and he failed. Thereafter, during the 11 years that he worked at Panera, between the time he was initially hired and the time that this collision occurred, he was involved in 4 separate crashes, one of which we knew was improper lane usage, that he essentially, from the evidence that we uncovered, did not appropriately appreciate his blind spot, ultimately leading to a crash. And so despite these other crashes, these other incidents that he had during those 11 years, this one being the 5th in 11 years, despite that, he didn't receive any retraining. And at no point in time was he trained about this concept of off-tracking on these relatively sharp left curves, where you bow it out to the right, bear to the right of the lane, so that the back end of the truck doesn't encroach over the center line, because the back end of the truck is going to track closer to the center line than the front end when you're steering into this curve. He was never trained that, and that was evidence at trial. Had the defendant driver from Panera bared to the right, this whole thing would have been avoided.
The Mercedes was saying, I maintained my lane the entire time. I never crossed over the center line, and I never encroached on the center line to make contact with the semi-tractor trailer. The operator of the semi-tractor trailer was also saying, I maintained my lane the entire time. I never crossed over or encroached the center line to make contact. As we know, that can't be true. They made contact with each other somehow. So one or both of them were at fault, and we were alleging that they were both at fault.
My first witness at trial was the trauma surgeon, and this was the first medical witness that the jurors got to hear from. We were able to use some of our demonstratives with this doctor. So the chest tube, his pneumothorax, which is just, it's a punctured lung. He had multiple fractured ribs, which were illustrated, his fractures to his legs, and also his heel, which was the focus of the case and his most significant injury. So he testified. It wasn't a long examination, but it's important to have the jury understand from a medical perspective all of the traumatic injuries that were a result from the collision. And again, this wasn't a case where there were defenses that there was pre-existing issues, perhaps, which defense attorneys like to argue. These were all traumatic injuries, and there was no dispute that they were caused by the collision. So the main purpose with this doctor was to educate the jury as to what the injuries were, where they are in the body, that they're all painful, they can be permanent in nature, and also require, in this case, lifelong treatment. There's an old saying, proper preparation prevents poor performance. And that's so true when you're getting for a trial, but I felt that we knew the case better than the defense lawyers. We were certainly more prepared. We also had a great jury. They were attentive every single day. And the way that the evidence came in was very, very clean. And when you get all of those factors working for you, it's a scenario where you should be taking home daily wins. And that's what we did in this case. We had a great team, and that goes all the way from the lawyers who litigated the case, but to the people behind the scenes, the paralegals who are with us in court, to the assistants who are back at the hotel doing things that we might be emailing them saying, hey, we need this, can you get it brought over to us immediately, to people who help drive, people like Bob, who can't walk all the way over to the courthouse.
Hearing the jury's verdict was really vindication, because when you start out in a case where the police report suggests one thing and you see evidence to suggest another thing, sometimes one might say that you're fighting an uphill battle, that it's not even a fight you should engage in. So when you get to the end and you ultimately have shown the jury what the truth was, because they got all of the evidence to decide exactly what happened here. And so it was very vindicating that 90% of the fault was put on Panera and its driver.
What this meant for the Krischons was justice. I think they were able to begin the painful process of moving on from this terrible chapter of their life, but also vindication as well, because this was a case that probably could have been settled many years ago for a lot less. But the insurance carrier, they did not want to admit that they did anything wrong, and they also didn't want to pay full and fair compensation. So when that happens, we take these cases to trial and we get results just like the one that we got. In terms of making a change, I hope companies pay attention to these kinds of verdicts, because if they cut corners on training and making sure that their drivers or employees are not acting safely, then they need to make changes. That's both in no longer retaining those individuals or having better training programs to make sure that their employees are properly trained, so that, one, these horrific accidents are avoided, but also it's going to ultimately save their bottom dollar at the end of the day. If they cause accidents like this, hopefully they end up at a law firm like ours, where we're adequately able to represent somebody with such catastrophic losses.